Welcome to the Executive Compensation Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Harvey, and on this episode, I'm joined by Virginia Rhodes. Virginia is a partner working out of Atlanta. Virginia, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
So, most corporate boards are led either by an independent chair or by a CEO chair. While still a minority practice, we're increasingly seeing companies utilize the role of executive chair to provide both board leadership and executive support to the company. The executive chair is often a transitional role, although there are also many approaches to structuring this role. Today, we're going to explore the executive chair in more detail. When might a company consider employing an executive chair? What's the interaction between the board and the management team? And how should they be compensated? So, Virginia, I want to start really just by kind of laying some groundwork of definitions of some of these different roles. So, there's typically four common board leadership roles. There's the CEO chair, there's the independent chair, there's the executive chair, which we're going to be spending most of our time talking about today, and then there's the lead director. Maybe you can just start by giving us some general definitions of these different board leadership roles.
Yeah, sure. So let's start with the CEO role, which is probably the most straightforward of the four. Of course, as you know, the CEO is typically responsible for establishing the strategic direction of the company and managing the day-to-day operations of the business. They set the tone of the organization. They define what operational success looks like. They shape the vision, the mission, the culture of the company, and they oversee all of the operational and financial decisions of the business. When combined with the chair role, the CEO chair would also then lead and coordinate the activities of the board, including presiding over board meetings, setting agendas, and serving as a liaison between the board and management. So let's contrast that with an executive chair. So by definition, the executive chair is also, like the CEO, an employee of the company. The executive chair serves as the leader of the board while maintaining an active and engaged role in shaping the strategic direction of the company. The executive chair often brings a deep level of understanding of the business. He or she provides advice and guidance to the CEO and other executives to then help shape the company's strategy. He or she is also oftentimes responsible for managing specific projects, whether it be related to M&A activity, transformation initiatives, new product launches, joint ventures, or other strategic partnerships. And this individual also serves or can serve as a point of contact for shareholders and other stakeholders to ensure effective governance and oversight of the business. So let's then talk about the non-executive chair. And this is kind of along a continuum you'll find of involvement in the day-to-day operations of the business to oversight and guidance on the strategic direction of the business. So the non-executive chair, as it says in its name, is not an executive of the company and does not typically have responsibility for managing day-to-day operations. Non-exec chairs are typically providing strategic direction to the executive team, overseeing the governance of the board, acting as a liaison between the independent directors and management, and then ensuring compliance with legal and regulatory requirements. They can also serve as a primary contact for stakeholders, but typically it's on more high-profile issues, things that relate to oversight and governance, or specific questions related to decisions made by the executive team. Lastly, the lead independent director. The lead independent director provides independent oversight of the board, and it is of particular importance when the chair is an employee, either combined with the CEO or serving as an executive chair. The lead independent director serves as a liaison between the independent directors and management. They typically coordinate executive sessions. They facilitate discussions among the independent directors, and they ensure the board fulfills its oversight and governance responsibilities. Similar to the non-executive director, a lead independent director can act as an alternative point of contact for external stakeholders should questions arise that require independence. And lastly, a lead independent director often serves on the Nominating Governance Committee as well and understands the roles of compliance, succession planning, and accountability.
So that lead director role, typically, I guess if you have a independent chair, you probably don't need that lead director role. It's really more common when you have either a CEO chair or an executive chair. Is that right?
That's exactly right. We do see on occasion the existence of both a lead independent director and a non-executive chair, but in those circumstances, it would be critically important to understand the difference in responsibility. Usually, the non-executive chair we find is more involved than the lead independent director, but most of the time, to your point, the lead independent director is kind of serving in that external oversight role.
Great. So we want to spend, of course, most of our time today talking about that executive chair role, which is kind of a unique role. Can take on a variety of different flavors depending on what a company is trying to accomplish it with that role. And as you were describing it, I was kind of thinking almost of like a Venn diagram with the executive chair kind of overlapping with some of the responsibilities that you would sometimes see a CEO oversee, and sometimes also overlapping with some of those independent chair responsibilities. So let's kind of explore that a little bit further. Maybe start by just telling me a little bit about how common is an executive chair, and then what is the path? What are some of the rationale why a company might want to implement an executive chair role?
Yeah. So it's interesting. The prevalence of executive chairs among large, U.S. companies is still relatively low, with about less than 15% of S&P 500 companies using this type of role within the business. However, I will say the percentage of executive chairs at companies undertaking a CEO transition is much higher. And secondly, this statistic is ever changing. And as a result of the tenure of these roles being typically fairly short. Typically, an executive chair is either a former CEO of the company and or founder of the organization, and often brings a deep level of understanding of the business and the industry. This role has become a great way for many companies to exit a retiring CEO to allow some short period of overlap to ensure a smooth transition for his or her replacement. Most executive chairs are only in the role for between 6 and call it 18 months, with 9 to 12 months being most common. And at some point, the reason for that shorter duration, I think, at some point, it can be difficult for the incoming CEO to make his or her mark on the business, or potentially shift strategic direction, or make a difficult or unique CapEx decision if the executive chair sticks around too long. So oftentimes we do see that shorter duration.
Yeah, and as you described, I mean, very often we see this as a role that is part of the succession planning. It's part of kind of the transition from one CEO to the next. And so, what are some of the benefits? What are some of the reasons why a company might want to consider using the executive chair role as a way to kind of work through that succession planning of CEOs?
Yeah. The addition of an executive chair can really be a useful succession planning tool for a couple of reasons. An executive chair can provide stability and continuity, both internally and externally, and added support to the executive leadership team, which can really be viewed as a significant advantage, particularly when the incoming CEO is maybe not a known quantity or is less experienced in the industry. An executive chair can also leverage his or her deep experience and knowledge of the company operations and industry insights because they typically come from the organization. They've been around for a while. They understand the challenges. He or she is often tasked with continuing to explore and execute either major strategic initiatives or potentially reorgs or shifts in strategy, which can then free up the time for the CEO to focus on day-to-day decisions of the existing business. And lastly, an executive chair role is often considered a kind of a planful stepping stone to retirement. This individual can provide hands-on onboarding to the new CEO while also scaling back his or her own involvement in the day-to-day operations. So it really can provide that helpful bridge to official retirement by allowing extended time in role and to provide that additional strategic guidance. The last thing that we have found that many companies like about having this kind of softer transition is related to compensation. It can also serve as a bridge if, for example, you have outstanding long-term incentive awards that, as we know, many of those vest over an extended period of time, up to 3 years or 4 years down the road. So some companies think about this over a very long term to allow some of that continued vesting to occur, which can, as you know, be significant benefit to the individual.
Yep, yep. So I want to get into kind of the magic question of around compensation, and this is a unique role. It's a role that has some of these executive characteristics. It's also a board member. As you were just describing, it's very often somewhat of a temporary role that's only in place for maybe a year or two. So, how do you go about compensating that type of role?
Yeah. So there are a few questions to consider. First of all, it's really important to be planful about this process. With discussions often starting a year or more in advance to ensure that there's ample time to deliberate on all the necessary aspects of this transition. So, with regards to compensation, the first place to start is in defining the roles, responsibilities, and delineation of duties for the role. And what that means is, what is the executive chair being tasked with versus the CEO versus a lead independent director, and how do all of those fit together? And it's really these unique facts and circumstances that drive pay decisions and frankly, and pay outcomes over time. So, some of the things that boards might want to ask themselves as they're thinking through this, just at a high level, is for example, with base salary. How should the base salary of the executive chair relate to the base salary of the current CEO and other executives? Number two, are there any precedents of former executive chairs that should be considered? And then three, what are the expectations of the current incumbent? It's helpful to have these conversations in advance as the board's thinking through some of these decision points. Secondly, with regards to annual incentives, and you'll see a theme here with both annual and long-term incentives. Should this participant be, or should this executive be a participant in these programs at all? So that's the kind of the first question. And some of this depends on the timing of the transition, how long the expected duration is. But should they be a participant? And if so, of course, at what level? And then if they are a participant, particularly in the annual incentive plan, should it be using the same metrics? Sometimes they might extend their term through the year through the end of the year, and they would oftentimes participate kind of at the current level based on where their percent of salary was as a CEO. But because they may have a reduced base salary, the dollars, of course, are different. If it rolls into a following year, then the committee should ask themselves, are there other metrics that we should be thinking about specific to certain milestones or areas of focus for this particular role that are important that should be woven into that annual plan? And then with respect to long-term incentives, and this is really where there's a lot of decisions to be thought through and should be kind of planned out well in advance. Again, should they participate in the regular annual LTI program? And if so, at what amount and what vehicles? As you know, most executives are participating in a combination of time-based awards as well as performance contingent awards. Because of the short duration often of this role, does that kind of 3-year LTI program make sense for him or her to be a participant of? Or should it be something that's a bit shorter in time, possibly not performance contingent at all? So these are some of the original decision points that are important for the committee to explore. And then lastly, with regards to outstanding or existing awards that may be as a result of prior CEO level grants, how is the board thinking about the treatment of those particular awards upon the retirement eventually as retiring from the executive chair role? Is there a desire for that individual to either continue to vest or accelerate vesting in a portion or all of those? And if so, the committee should be very planful in the last year or two of CEO level grants that they have the right provisions in place to allow that to happen.
So, if I think about typical board member compensation, it normally consists of an annual retainer, which is generally paid in cash, some sort of an equity award, which again is typically an annual award to directors, and then there's typically various committee fees and sometimes chair fees and whatnot. What you just described sounds a lot more like an executive pay arrangement than a board pay arrangement. With salary and potentially an annual bonus and some sort of an equity award. So it feels a little bit while unique, it feels like it's leaning more towards what we might see on the executive side of compensation as opposed to what I would call a typical board comp
Yes.
package.
Absolutely. And it's a good differentiation point, and that's why defining the roles up front are so important because as I mentioned at the start of the call, the difference between an executive chair versus a non-executive chair can be significant. And where that really comes to play is the amount of interaction and day-to-day involvement in the business that the executive chair would typically have. So this is not, somebody that comes in 4 or 5 times a year provides oversight and guidance. This individual is usually more day to day. They're mentoring the CEO. They're providing strategic direction, kind of on daily activities. It's much more involved, and as a result, the pay is typically much higher than it would be otherwise. And so, what that pay arrangement might look like, and again, there's lots of factors that influence the quantum and the design of pay. But what that pay typically looks like is, of course, it's usually less than the CEO, but it might oftentimes be, one of the kind of the top five executive officers. We often see this as a proxy reported role. However, that's not always the case. Again, depending on some of these facts and circumstances. So, what we typically do when looking at how best to approach this kind of compensation discussion is we look at a couple different reference points, and this is important for committees to understand, but then also to apply their own facts and circumstances to it. Some of the helpful reference points are: what is the relationship within a broad group of companies? What is the relationship between a typical executive chair's compensation and their pay, their prior pay as a CEO? And this, of course, only applies to those who've gone through that transition, which is the majority of them. It's also helpful to look at the relationship between the compensation for the executive chair and the new incoming CEO, and really being deliberate about what you want that relationship to be. And it's important not only to look at the total, but also each of the elements individually. And then lastly, just like any other benchmarking exercise, you're going to look at the dollar value of what a typical executive chair might receive, recognizing that when we do these types of analyses, we do see quite a wide variance. The other interesting point is we often find that size is not as a significant corollary to pay as it might be for other executive benchmarkings. We often see a kind of a tighter range, regardless of size, when we look at executive chair pay information than we do for a CEO, for example. So as we kind of identify each of those various data points, what we often find, and again, it does vary, but what we often find is if we look at kind of the median reduction in total pay from the executive chair's prior role as CEO, it's usually somewhere about half, with the majority of the pay cut coming in the long-term incentive component. Usually we see base salary getting reduced, 25 percentage points or so. Annual incentive, again, depending on the timing, the tenure, the duration expectation, it might remain a similar percent of salary, but because of the base salary reduction, you're looking at a reduced target bonus as well. And then the long-term incentive oftentimes gets cut in half, again, depending on how long the person is expected to be in that role and at what time during the year they actually transition. If we then take that and also look at how that compares to the incoming CEO, usually it turns out to be about a third less than the incoming CEO, because oftentimes a new CEO's pay will be less than the outgoing CEO's pay. And then lastly, if we look at kind of dollar values, and again, this varies based on industry, a little bit based on size, depending on kind of your revenue buckets. But if we're talking, large caps, S&P 500, S&P 250 type of executive chairs, what we've seen historically is you might have a base salary of around $1 million. You might have bonus somewhere between that 150 and 175% of base. And then LTI is really where the large variance comes into play, anywhere from, call it 5 to 10 million, depending on, again, all of these other criteria that are so important. So lastly, and with respect to the compensation piece, some of the things that need to be discussed in advance, the timing of the transition is critical. If you're talking beginning of the year, you might make different pay decisions than if it's halfway through the year or towards the end. Obviously, expected time and role. This is not something that you can always determine up front, but to the extent there is some level of understanding of the duration for this position, I think that's helpful. And then, of course, just defining what the roles and responsibilities and expected time commitment are. All of those really influence what the pay amounts tend to be.
Yeah, if you were to boil that down, those different parameters that you laid out there, I mean, a rule of thumb I've often kind of thrown out, and I think it's consistent with the stats that you were just quoting, is somewhere between maybe 50% to 80% of the new CEO is kind of the range you might see an
Yep.
executive chair. But as you said, it can vary dramatically. I've seen examples of executive chair is making more than the new CEO, and I've seen examples where an executive chair is essentially making the same as what you might see as an independent chair. So
Yep.
there is
And everywhere in
a lot
between.
of range there, as you said.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's important too to understand that this is also something that may evolve over time. There's plenty of circumstances where you might do some sort of haircut at time of transition, and then if the individual does stay on a little bit longer than normal, but pulls back on the day to day responsibilities, you might see those amounts decreasing over time as well. And
Yeah.
then lastly, I think, as we look through this information kind of from an external landscape, it's important to understand that each of these individuals has a unique set of facts and circumstances behind them. It's really important to understand if you're looking at an executive chair who's been a former founder who might have lots of money already on the long-term incentive component or within in the stock component overall, so they may not need or want to participate in a long-term incentive program versus someone that's newer in the role, that's just a former CEO that really wants to continue to add value and maybe looking at this as a bit of a longer term objective. So it's important to understand some of the background of the examples as well.
Yeah. Well, one other question, just externally, are there any kind of bright lines or anything that we need to be concerned about from both an investor and a proxy advisor perspective when they're evaluating how you're paying these types of roles?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important piece is as you think about the magnitude, you will oftentimes hear, I think, from the investor community as well as from the proxy advisors alike, if the roles are paid similarly, that can be viewed negatively. Because the thought is you've got two people doing the same thing and you're paying twice for it. So I do think it's helpful to again ensure that to the extent you're willing to disclose some of the duties and responsibilities through the proxy statement or through your corporate governance website. It's important to do that. It's obviously important to kind of educate investors, again, delineate responsibilities both internally and externally, make sure that they understand kind of who's in charge and who they should go to with certain questions. But from a general proxy advisor perspective, what we find is they don't worry as much about with if the pay is reduced it gets looked at just as any other NEO might, and it gets averaged in with the other NEOs as they're looking at a comparison to the CEO. But usually when there's additional scrutiny put in place, it's when they're paid either similarly or pretty close to it.
Okay. So I guess just any final thoughts, any steps that you would suggest the committee take as they're thinking about potentially, using this as a transitional structure?
Yeah, I think just in closing, the defining of duties and responsibilities is critical. It's also important to make sure everyone understands how this role will interact with the independent board members and what structure changes, if any, are needed to ensure that this happens effectively. Are there changes to the corporate governance guidelines? Are there changes to how meetings are structured and how meetings operate? Are there changes to how this individual might have to interact with the lead independent director? So I think understanding kind of that chain of command internally helps make this a smoother transition. It's also important to ensure that the executive team understands who will be the ultimate decision maker and how should the executive team kind of view that hierarchy. I think this is probably one of the maybe more challenging aspects of having this structure in place because the incoming CEO certainly wants to make their mark, but the executive chair is likely still the one that's providing the kind of oversight and guidance from a strategic standpoint. And then lastly, determining a communication plan. When will the announcement come out? What will be included in the announcement? Will you put forth, your paid proposal that the board has approved at the time of announcement? Does that come later in terms of decision making? So getting in place a kind of a timeline of announcements and both internal and external communications is also critical.
Great, great. Well, this is a structure that not every board is going to have to consider, every year, obviously, because this is a kind of a minority type of role. But when it does come up, it can be very helpful to have this approach, and it is a complicated topic that you really have to kind of think through all of these different angles. So, Virginia, thanks again for joining the podcast today.
Yeah, I appreciate the time, Ryan. Thanks.